Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you over my YouTube channel, Anton GF, from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we have a very interesting episode, very interesting to me personally because of the book that we're going to be talking about, because of the topic of the book that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to have a guest on the show that has written a book called Women in Jazz, The Women, the Legends, and Their Fight. It has been released not too long ago. It's hot off the presses, actually, on Eighth House Publishing in this year of 2019. And she's joining us from Suffolk in the United Kingdom. She sounds really, you will see, as though she were right here next door, but she's an ocean away. And, you know, she is a teacher, a musician, a writer. She has lived very close to jazz music throughout her life, and she's visiting us today on the Jazz Flashes podcast to talk about this book, Women in Jazz. Sammy Stein. Sammy, thank you so much for answering our call here on the Jazz Flashes podcast.
That's really nice to be here. Thank you for calling me.
Well, I saw your book and became instantly interested in the book, and so I want to talk about the book, as extensively as possible. But before that, I would like to know maybe a little bit more about yourself, and so I have a couple of questions about that. For example, you have lived all your life around music, and I wonder what would be your earliest musical-related memories?
Well, I grew up, my sister is a pianist, so I grew up with hearing her practice the piano. And my dad used to bring in records, vinyls. I think he got them free with petrol or something. so they were quite an eclectic mix. So people like Chris Mongay's, a lot of rock and roll compilations, stuff like that. When I went to school, I took part in choirs and orchestras, and I learnt to play the clarinet and then the oboe. And I remember, with my mother in particular, going to classical concerts, Handel and, things that were far too long and too boring when I was too small was things like Elijah and things like that. So that kind of put me off classical music because I think I was exposed to kind of too much too young. But then I began to kind of find, when I was like in my teen years, I began to find different kind of music and music like Gershwin, Shostakovich, Schoenberg, music like that. So it was a very strange progression, but it progressed.
I hear rock music, I hear classical music, but I don't hear the word jazz yet. So
No,
what was it that drove you to jazz, and what did you find attractive about it?
Well, when I was young, I always sought out the slightly different music. I really liked people like Madness, Ian Dury and the Blockheads, the Stranglers, punk music, and I kind of knew the music that I didn't like more than what I did like, and jazz. When I was growing up, I was in a few bands and things, but jazz was always kind of spoken of like it was in the past and or of a particular era. And I've heard people like Armstrong, and I found it incredibly relaxing. And I realised there was this kind of syncopation in the music. But jazz people, they had names like Stanley, Albert, so that it kind of brought into it being like something of when you're 16, and people have all these kind of old names, and I was just so ignorant, and I had very little exposure to it. And then when I did music O level and studied music a bit more, I began to read about people. And one of the sort of things that I began to really read about was the people who made jazz music and their stories. And at the time I was really interested in sociology. So it was things like how for commercialization, they changed the name from jazz to jazz. The record labels kind of took it away from where it came from, and kind of honed it to suit a particular audience. They would groom their players, etc. And one of the big memories for me, I remember, was hearing Albert Ayler. And I loved Gershwin, and I'd sung "Summertime" as a solo, and I'd done Porgy and Bess and things like that. But hearing Isla play "Summertime" and knowing about Isla just kind of did something to me, because he was saying, it isn't this how Gershwin wrote it, all rose-coloured, and that is not how it was. He was saying this is how it is, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Isla's version of "Summertime," but it is just extraordinary. And then I found really different players like the People Band, who are a UK band here, Peter Broatsman, Mats Gustafsson, and it was kind of, I just knew that was my kind of music. And then a bit later, I kind of went backwards. I went to Miles, Monk, Coltrane, Billie Holiday, and people like that. So it's been quite an eclectic journey, but it's a definite journey.
So from what you're mentioning, it seems a little bit like you were attracted by the free jazz first, and then you kind of went backwards in time, at least, to some of the earlier masters. Was it maybe the freedom in the sound of the music, the freedom of choice, something like that attracted you to free jazz? Because I must say that there are a lot of people who are usually put off by free jazz.
No, I mean, what I found with free jazz is that it's the musical understanding that kind of underlines it all, because the musical rules, like that I had kind of ingrained into me from classical and everything, from when I was very small, you can hear it in the free jazz. There are root chords, there are scale progressions. You can hear them switching keys and everything. So I think you kind of need that background, and a lot of them are, they've played all genres. They haven't ever just played jazz. And really anything, when you if you syncopate the beat, you can jazz it up, as they say. But I think freeform, it extends that, and although you're kind of hanging everything around a single chord, maybe it's the journey to and from that chord that makes it interesting.
And at some point in your life, you went from being a listener, from listening to jazz, to actually writing about jazz. Can you tell us a little bit about how that began?
Well, I've decided that I wanted to share the music that I was beginning to like, and more importantly, understand. So because I liked the People Band, and I could go and see them and things, I went and wrote a piece about their sort of history. And one of the members of the band, actually, I'd met him at a Blockheads gig, and he came in on it with me and corrected a couple of points, and that was great, because it was, I could then submit it with kind of an authority, because I'd had stuff published before in other magazines, but just on general topics. So I submitted it there's a really good online magazine here called London Jazz News, mm-hmm. And I didn't think it would even get published. I thought it would just be like, thanks but no thanks. But anyway, it got published straight away, and then I thought, well, okay, I've had a piece published on jazz. I'm happy now. I'm going to share the music. And then they All About Jazz. They had an editor at the time called John Kelman, and he called me and asked if I'd like to write for them. He said he really liked what I'd done, so he gave me a column. And then he also, as we got talking, and he realised that I had quite an extensive sort of interest, and had got to know a few people, he gave me another column called Scumbles, which I could use to write about anything music related. So I went from having no kind of platform to having two on one of the biggest, jazz publications. And then came Jazz in Europe, and then came Kind of Jazz. And now I ended up with so many that I had to really cut it down. So I now write for Something Else Reviews, Free Jazz Collective, and Jazz Views, because those three I can place most of the music that I really like. I know the readership. So, like Free Jazz Collective, obviously that's where I would put my my freeform articles, but also Something Else Reviews. They've got an editor there who's a bit of a free jazz nut as well, so I slide the occasional free jazz thing their way. And Jazz Views are they're more general, but he does more extensive articles and more in depth. So I've now got three platforms that are just completely suitable for what I write about, really.
Around what year are we talking about that you began writing about jazz in earnest?
But when I actually got the nerve to write about it, it was about 2012. So it wasn't very long ago at all.
But you didn't just write about jazz in publications of that kind, but you've also written, at least at this point, a couple of books about jazz. One of them is called "All That's Jazz," and of course the
Well,
one that we're
thank you
going to
for
be,
that.
and of course the one that we're going to be talking about today, which is women in jazz. I'm not saying that writing a book is more important than writing a column or writing in publications. In fact, I read a lot of jazz publications and get a lot of information that way. But how did that first book come about?
Well, I knew that I wanted to write more about jazz. But I realised that jazz it's an industry, so it's not just the people at the front. So I got people interested in the idea of a book exploring all the parts of the industry, because I'd started to do some radio shows with there's an incredible radio station in the US called Jazz Bites Radio, and they support new music and also established music. They've got 3 different channels, and they've got this massive 58,000 in number collection of jazz records. It's an incredible sort of resource for musicians, and they were really supportive of just about everything that I did. So they sponsored. I'm probably going a bit off track here, but they sponsored a jazz festival that I ran in London in 2017. And I wanted to get people to kind of buy into the fact that it's not just the people that you see on stage. There's so many people behind. So I interviewed record companies, radio hosts, photographers, and musicians and singers, and just everybody that was involved in it, and sort of called in all my contacts, and wrote this book called All That's Jazz, and Tomahawk Press published it, and then kind of out of that. When I did the London Jazz platform, I showcased 14 acts from Europe, New Orleans and the UK across a whole day. And there were 49 musicians altogether and 12 women. And somebody came up to me and said, you've got so many women at one event. But, like I said, it was less than a quarter were actually female. And I'd chosen them simply because they were good. So then I did a radio series called Ladies in Jazz, and according to the owners of the radio station, it just got this massive listeners' response. And I met and heard some amazing female musicians like Faye Patton, Kim Cypher, Camille Thurman, Jane Ara Bloom, and quite often in conversation it was clear that some of them felt a bit sidelined. So I decided that there was more to this. So I put together a synopsis for a book telling about the journeys of women in jazz, with no agenda really. I just wanted to know more about their journeys in jazz. So not just the musicians, but the people behind the scenes as well. And 3 publishers offered to go with it, and out of those I chose to go with 8th House.
So we could say that this book, Women in Jazz, The Women, the Legends, and Their Fight, that just came out not too long ago in this year of 2019, actually evolved out of your personal experience with the jazz world and the jazz industry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I suppose I wasn't writing it from my viewpoint as obviously I'm a woman, but I was just writing it because I knew that there were just these incredible musicians out there. Sarah Brand, incredible trombone player, and and Wendy Kirkland, amazing pianist, and yet people just. They could list all these male musicians and they just kind of couldn't list the female ones. And I thought, well, hang on, why is that? Because when I did the London Jazz platform, I just chose people because I knew they were good. I wasn't even thinking about gender or anything else. So yeah, that's kind of, it was I was just interested, really, and I thought it would make an interesting thing for people to read. And really, I wanted just to know more about these women's journeys, because I've got people of 70, people of 20s, and I just wanted to kind of see, you know, is jazz different from anything else? Has anything changed? That kind of thing, and get the reader involved with that discussion as well.
You're listening to the voice of Sammy Stein, coming loud and clear over the internet from Suffolk in the United Kingdom. She just wrote a book called Women in Jazz, The Women, the Legends, and Their Fight. And we're chatting about the book and about this very interesting topic that this book delves in. And, you know, one of the things that, as I was reading parts of your book, one of the things that I was thinking about is that usually when considering women in jazz, the general public usually thinks of vocalists, you know, like Billie Holiday or Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Anita O'Day, and different of those classic names that come to mind readily, you know. And that despite the fact that there are many great female instrumentalists as well that are not just merely singers, you know. In some cases, they're both instrumentalists and singers, like Nina Simone, Blossom Dearie, for example. Why do you think this is, that we think of women mostly as jazz singers and not so much as jazz musicians or jazz instrumentalists?
Mm. Well, this is just my opinion, but from the sort of several years of discussion that have led to this book, what I think is that many of the early women performers, they were kind of pioneers in terms of women who spoke out, but they didn't at first. They kind of did their time, you know, being the decorative addition to a band. But so most did their time as an ornamentation, if you like. But it was when they understood that as popular entertainers and females, they actually had a power, and they began to use that power to speak out against things which needed to change. Because there are other women. There's Melba Liston. There's the Sweethearts of Rhythm. There's Hazel Scott, who were amazing, but they were often, at least initially, supported by men. And it was only once that they found fame that they spoke out. And there was also, at the beginning, there was also something kind of pervasive which seemed to go against women, like Hazel Scott. Amazingly talented, clever woman, and yet she was accused of being a communist, blacklisted, and her name appeared on this Red Channel's list. But it's important to note also there were men who supported female performers, as Billy Eckstine, for example, and also women helped other women behind the scenes. There was a lady called Gladys Mosier who heard Maxine Sullivan singing, introduced her to Claude Thornhill, who's the pianist, and arranged her to record. I've forgotten the label that she recorded for, but this woman, quite quietly arranged, and there were quite a few writers speaking up. But I think it's also a little bit. It's just easy to kind of blame male culture, because when you think of where jazz evolved, it came out of pretty seedy places where, and the women they kind of had a different expectation of themselves back then as well. So I think it's not only acceptance on a wide thing, but it's also expectations that have changed. I personally think, from talking to women.
Do you, usually we think, and this happens in general with jazz musicians, whether male or female, that over the history of jazz, there has been more of an appreciation of some of these musicians in Europe than here in the United States. And this has to do with many different factors that we don't really need to delve into right now. But do you think it's also the case with female jazz musicians? Maybe they were, throughout the history of jazz, more appreciated over in Europe than here in their own country?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot, Nina Simone, a lot came over to Europe because they found the kind of the underlying issues in America too great, and they were frustrated in their efforts to just be who they were. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, definitely.
You were talking also about the roles of women within jazz just a few minutes ago, and one of the things that I was wanting to ask you regarding what the perceived roles of women within jazz was and is how do you think, or how has, if in any way, how has the role of women within jazz and their presence within the jazz world and the jazz community changed throughout the decades? Do you think that gender roles within jazz have evolved over time, kind of aligning themselves with the way in which these gender roles maybe have also changed in the culture in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have to remember is it's no longer binary. You know, there's men, women, everything in between. It's not a black and white world, and these issues are actually quite complex. And I have to reiterate, when I wrote the book, I mean, I didn't intend it to be about these issues. So these issues have come from the women. You know, they've been raised along with a lot of other things. You know, their adventures and funny things in the book. But I think from what I've seen, things are improving. It's just so slowly. So when I came into jazz, I was kind of unaware of these real issues. And it was only by speaking to the women that I realised that these issues that I thought were so old-fashioned are still here. So gender roles have definitely changed over time, and jazz music has always reflected society. And you get this all the time from any musician that you speak to. So when society changes, a little while later, maybe jazz reflects this. And I think, too, it's important to remember, as I said, that, you know, where jazz originated from. So expectations have changed. But it's kind of annoying as well because, you know, or classical orchestras have moved on. They have blind auditions so that it's less biased when they choose musicians and things. But you still hear stories like you hear of there's one of my friends. She's a woman band leader, and she called a venue to arrange some gigs, and the manager told her, "No, we don't have any dates." She got her bass player to call, saying that he was the manager. He was offered 3 dates. And then other women tell me that when they've been, you know, trying to get on festival lineups, they literally get told to their face, "We've got enough females on the list now. Thank you very much." And then it gets even more complex because some women don't help. One of them told me that she liked being the only female member of a band because she gets all the attention, and she finds working with other women competitive. So it's kind of frustrating because so rather than checking out just the music, there's lots of other things which kind of creep in as well.
Why do you think that is, though? Why do you think that there are so many other things that come into play when it comes to, you know, hiring a woman jazz musician, a female jazz musician, but those things don't come into play when hiring a male jazz musician?
I think some of them do. You know, I mean, someone said to me, you know, a male jazz pianist could be, you know, could sweat like a pig, be the size of a hippo, and still he'd get applause. If a female jazz musician came on and, you know, sweated like a pig, weighed the same as a hippo, and was just as good, she'd probably get a lot of derogatory comments. So it's jazz reflects us, unfortunately. And I think that's what comes across.
When you read the stories of female jazz musicians and vocalists from the past throughout the history of jazz, I think one of the most difficult things that a lot of them had to deal with was the fact that whether they were singers or not, but particularly if they were not, if they were instrumentalists, they had to fight this idea that the promoters would always present them as female instrumentalists, mostly as a novelty, simply because, you know, they were women playing a specific instrument, like Melba Liston with the trombone or something like that. We have not shed that idea yet in 2019.
No, I mean, I was when I was doing the research for the book. I mean, you know, I did years of reading articles and talking to people, and there was an article from about 99 or something like that, but relatively recent, where a girl went along for she was a trumpet player, and she went along, she did a great audition, and as she walked out they asked if she would raise her skirt so that they could have a look at her legs. And I just thought, that was in 1999. That's not long ago. And yeah, it just makes you cringe, actually. And it's kind of embarrassing that a fellow music lover would actually do that,
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, the year when that happened, because if I didn't know that, I would think, you're talking about a female band singer from the big band era in the 1930s
Exactly,
or 40s, what they used to call canaries, which itself was or can be seen as sort of a derogatory term these days. So, it's in many ways, it's really sad to hear a story like that. But as you said, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, jazz does reflect, the society in which we live. You mentioned, Sammy, that you had done extensive research for this book. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you carried out that research?
Well, mainly it was talking to people, and it was, well, first of all, it was asking. I wanted to get women from as wide an age range, as wide a cultural background. So, I wanted different voices, different places, different eras. I wanted people to be able to kind of compare. So the first thing was contacting people and asking them. So there were some that I knew, about 60% I knew already, and 40% I didn't. And I was bowled over when every single woman that I asked said yes, they would love, they would love to have this chance. And right from the start, I said to them, this is just about your story. It's just about your journey. It's to allow the reader to kind of, travel with you for a bit. And they absolutely loved that idea. So then I did a lot of work. I went to the British Library because I've become a professional reader there. So you get access to the music rooms and the reading rooms, so you can go through all these really old books and these records of transactions and things. So that was all really interesting as well.
The book does have this feel of an oral history component to it, for sure, and I think it's clear reading the book. And I must say, I did not read the whole thing because I've only had enough, so much time to prepare the interview. But I did read a big chunk of the book, and it does sound to me like there was a lot of conversation going on as you were preparing for this book. And I find that interesting because you are giving the chance to people that usually don't get that chance to actually speak about their experiences. And I think that enriches the book. In that sense, or in any sense, did you find any difficulties that you had to face as you were carrying out the research or writing the book? Anything that you could mention about that?
Well, like I said, I mean, my goals were simply to hear and share the women's stories. So right from the start, they knew that they were talking to a worldwide audience. So they kind of they cut the swearing and things like that. They were very, very genteel. And right from the start, one of the promises I made was that I wouldn't change anything apart from if I was going to protect them, because sometimes, people can make a slip up and forget, that certain people might read books. So I just asked to hear their stories, their adventures, how they came to jazz, their encouragement from home, their education, ideas, funding, etc., etc. And I wanted people to realise that women are not just present now as musicians, but, all the other roles, radio hosts, PR, photographers. And the only problem that I really had when I wrote the book was that I had so many incredible stories. And I initially set it out in very strict chapters, okay, we're going to talk about education, funding, blah, blah. But then I thought because then I had to sort of take their conversations apart. I thought, no, this isn't working. So how can we do this? So the publisher and I came up with this idea that we're just all at a big gatherings, having a drink or a coffee, we're all around this huge table. So I'm putting the questions, and then we went from there, and they loved that idea. I explained it to them, and then my job as the author was to weave these stories together, and that's how it came about, really.
Did you have, or did you come across any instance in which some of these musicians said, "Well, I'm going to tell you this, but this is something you can't publish"?
Only one. And yeah, and I can fully understand that. Yeah. So yeah, only one. Yeah.
Now, besides the view that maybe some promoters or the public at large may have about female jazz musicians, was there any discussion of certain other roles, like for example maternity, and how that influenced the choices that these women have to make in their careers?
Yeah, I mean, there was one who said to me, "The minute you become a mother, your jazz career stops." But it also depends on your character, and I think what really came across is that what women want is choice, because a lot of them were saying, okay, the minute that you have a kid or a child, or or even you get married with some of them, they were saying, people kind of lose interest in you because they see your career is going to be shorter. But others said it makes absolutely no difference. I can be a good mum and a brilliant musician. So it's about having that choice, and not just for the women actually, but for the men. So people get together, they might have a child, and the man or woman might decide to stay at home and look after the child, or carry on and have child mums, whatever. They also might decide to pick up a baritone sax and go and lead a band. And men and women should have that choice. I think that's what really came across when I spoke to people. So the women don't see themselves kind of defined by these old-fashioned roles anymore.
This comes up in many of the episodes of the Jazz Flashes podcast that I have already published and that I've already recorded, over the years. But there was a time in the history of this country, of the United States, when jazz was actually the popular music of the day, and it was possible to turn on the radio or then later on the TV and find jazz. And jazz was what was selling. And jazz was what created the hit records. Talking about the 30s, the 40s, the 50s maybe, until the onslaught of rock and roll changed that a little bit or quite a bit. Did you find in your interviews with these female jazz musicians, and also with, I must say that you don't only talk to musicians, but also to people within the industry at large for this book. Did you find any indications when you talk to them about how the current situation of jazz as not the popular music of the day, as sort of like a kind of music that lives on at universities and specialized concert venues and stuff like that, almost like if it were classical music. Some people call it the classical music of America, right? Did you find any indication that this makes it even more difficult for musicians to survive in this world?
Well, I mean, I know it's a national. There's kind of complex issues here, but I know there's a Jazz Act that actually protects jazz music as the national music of America. We don't have the same kind of thing here, but I know that jazz, it's lost it. I mean, the American government used to send people like Louis Armstrong out on PR tours to the to the Eastern Bloc to try and promote American values and things. So, they very much used the jazz musicians as well. But I think what happened was, if you go back even like 15 years maybe in the UK, and certainly in Europe and I think in the US as well, from the people I've spoken to, jazz was kind of assigned to the past. And what people forget is that creative musicians are creative musicians. And what's kind of happened is that jazz, there is the jazz of the 50s and there's the jazz of the 60s, and that is definitely of that era. But what the young people are doing is they are still taking jazz, they're taking syncopation, and they are infusing it with this amazing energy and this incredible creative difference. And so jazz is, particularly in the UK, jazz really does live on. And it's what's happening is there's East London Jazz, there's Jazz Refreshed, and these are venues that you have the veterans playing alongside. So you might have Evan Parker playing alongside Binker and Moses. So you've got this, people in the 70s against people in their 20s and 30s, and you've got this incredible fusion of this energy and this kind of passing on of those skills and the encouragement. And you go anywhere, Cafe Otto, places like that, they are stuffed with young people, because they are finding jazz again. And I covered a gig for the BBC not so long ago, and we were interviewing people afterwards, and one of them just said, "This is the alternative music. Pop music has got so samey." And he said, this is my second jazz gig. And he said, I absolutely love it. And I've actually taken people to jazz gigs for the first time. And I think they've kind of gone along, almost with a book ready to kind of switch off. But they've just been totally engrossed, especially in the kind of, I took a friend to Peter Broadsman the other week, and she couldn't believe it. She just found it just so incredible. And I've taken people to go and see people like Barb Younger, and these people, the jazz musicians, they're very accessible as well.
I have found that to be true, actually, in my interviewing them for the podcast, and just being in contact with them. I do like that about jazz musicians. It is true of some country artists as well here in the south of the United States, but it's not the case with other, more important, more famous, more successful artists. And that has always been something that has attracted me about jazz. The fact that I don't play an instrument, I just know what I like and what I don't like, and I collect records and books and different things about jazz, and I try to spread the word about jazz as much as I can. But the fact that the musicians are approachable is definitely a plus for me.
Yeah, but I mean, you were saying that about more important ones. I mean, for my next book, I approached people like Sheila Jordan, Selena Albright, who are really huge names. And for my last book, I had Patti Boulay, and they're people who, excuse me, a few years ago I wouldn't have approached, because they're not approachable, but I emailed their agents or emailed them, and I was just gobsmacked that the next day I'd get a reply saying, "Yes, Sammy, I'd love to come in on this." It's I think with people with jazz, it's whether they're big or small, they still, I don't mean big or small, I mean, famous or not so famous. They, if they buy into something, an idea, a project, they're there.
Yeah, I meant more musicians of other styles of music that are more popular these days, that if you wanted to approach them, it would be harder. The fact that jazz musicians that are more famous or more important in the history of the music are also approachable is also a wonderful thing. Before we began the recording, Sammy, I told you that I do have a certain fascination with the United Kingdom, and I see that over the history of jazz, I think in England, the scene has always been very interesting. The local scene, but also the musicians from America that appeared in England, and all those great radio and TV shows from the BBC that have kept and have allowed certain performances and certain performers to just be captured for posterity. In many cases. I wanted to ask you a little bit, since you are based out of the United Kingdom. My question is, can you tell us a little bit more about what you see that the presence of jazz is within the media in the United Kingdom, and whether that is in some way different to the United States?
In the media, I think it's got a fairly steady presence actually. Maybe you need to look a little deeper than you would normally, but it's got a great presence, and I think what's made quite a difference, worldwide is the internet. Because it doesn't matter where you are in the world, and I think this is what has enriched jazz as well, is that we now have access to so many different kinds of musics that kind of are taken under the jazz umbrella.
And that was actually another question that I had for you, since you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you have done some internet radio work, which it really, the internet is one of the main ways. If you can imagine, I live in Jackson, Tennessee, and this is definitely not a town where jazz has a big following, or there's not really a lot of opportunities to listen to jazz. Fortunately, we're close enough to Memphis and to Nashville that once in a while I can have access to live jazz acts, and that's always important for me as well, because I love listening to recordings, but being there in person is very, very important, and it's really a totally different experience in any kind of music, but I think particularly in the case of jazz. Now, you mentioned the internet. You've done and you do radio work on the internet. Tell us a little bit about what your opinion of the internet is as a place for showcasing new acts in jazz, whether it be male or female. What positive aspects do you see, or what negative aspects do you see of the internet, if any?
Okay, I mean, I've done other radio work, like with the BBC, as well as the internet. But the internet is a really important tool, because musicians use social media like Facebook and Twitter, and it's a way of connecting with others. For example, my Twitter account, it's like Jazz Corner. There are just so many amazing people all connected. I mean, you found me on there. There's so many amazing people all connected to jazz in some way. And it's also important because it offers a choice of when to listen and how to listen. And things like digital radio stations, they just make these amazing shows, and people can listen live or go back to them when they like. And podcasts and blogs, they're great as well. But I think there's still a place for paper magazines, and one of the most important things for me is live events that offer incredible opportunities, because you can tweet about things and Facebook about things, but there's nothing like the music played live. And it also allows you to see close at hand the changes that are happening. So you can see that young people are filling the jazz venues more, and there's also more women in the audiences. And I think that's because they're seeing more on stage and can relate to them. And it used to be a problem, like, the internet's been really good in other ways, because when I first started going to gigs, I used to go to gigs alone, which did bring about a few problems. But now there are internet, organisations that you can find on the internet, like the London Jazz Meetup, which means that if you're a single, photographer, writer, and obviously if you're a woman or if you're a young person and you're thinking about going to a gig on your own, you can contact the Jazz Meetup, and there's 9 times out of 10 there'll be 3 or 4 other people who are going to that event, and you meet up in a safe way. So the internet's, it's been useful on so many different ways, really.
Usually the negative side of the internet that you sometimes hear about is the fact that there is so much information out there that you really need to know where to look, because it would be difficult. It would be easy to kind of get lost in the middle of so much offer. Do you share that view?
Well, not really, because when I first started, I didn't use Facebook, and I didn't use Twitter. But since I then started using Twitter, everybody who's on my Twitter feed and my Twitter line is they're all jazz related or musician related. So really from there, I've got all these thousands of people now who make contact, and we're in contact, and obviously you don't speak to every one of them every day, but if there's something important or an issue or an important article or something, then it's shared there. So because we have these kind of jazz corner things, we don't have to search the whole internet, because they'll say, oh, Sammy needs to know about this, I'm going to go, I'll tweet her. So it's very quick because they're short. Sometimes when you get emails, they'll go forever before they actually get to their point, but on Twitter you've only got 100 or 50 characters. You've got to get it in there.
The music industry, though, has changed so much, the recording industry in particular, that I suppose that all of these live gigs are the main way for these musicians to survive financially.
Yeah, I mean, every record label will tell you that that CDs and records don't make money, and yet the record labels continue and continue and continue. So you kind of think, but because it used to be that gigs were kind of the lowest income, but now people sell CDs, books, and things at merchandise at gigs. So gigs, I think they were way back. They've now become quite an important part of the income of a decent jazz musician. Yeah, for sure.
You're listening to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson, Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And our guest today is Sammy Stein, who is coming to you from Suffolk in the United Kingdom, in England. And she just wrote a book that has been published not too long ago, called Women in Jazz, The Women, the Legends, and Their Fight, published by Eighth House Publishing in this year of 2019. And I'm wondering, Sammy, you've talked a little bit already about the goals that you had in mind as you were preparing this book and then researching this book and then writing the book. Have you gotten any feedback from readers already?
Yeah, I mean, the reviews have been just amazing. I mean, it was only out this month, so I've only had 2 reviews, but I've done quite a few radio shows on, suddenly on the back of it, it's like, whoa, okay, got to go to the studio, people have just been either very kind or they've genuinely found that it's, and I think it's really nice when I went on Amazon today and there was a really a 4 or 5 star review of the book, and from someone who I didn't know, so it's obviously just someone who's bought the book and thought, yeah, I like this book, and I read the review and it was really positive. And then Jazz Views, they did a really, really good review. And then again, someone who I didn't know, a lady called Debbie Burke, jazz author, she wrote this incredibly positive review. And yeah, I mean, everybody has just been so lovely about it. One of the biggest things that come across is a lot of them say about time. that's been I think in all 3 reviews they sort of said, this book has been a long time coming, and it's about time that somebody actually produced a book like this, because there have been a lot of books about women in jazz. Maybe they're written by men, but I think a book where the women speak throughout the book, so it's this long conversation, I think people really like, and the women liked, and because one of the things that I always feel bad saying this, but it was great fun to write the book, because some of the stories are very funny. Sometimes when you speak to people, you get that lovely the eye contact. You can tell their sincerity and how they're sort of really feeling what they're saying, and it's so I enjoyed that. When I was writing it, I didn't enjoy the research so much because it was just getting the facts. But the actual people contact and talking to them, and then doing the radio shows and things like that. It's just a great thing, really. And it's kind of, I think it's opened up doors for women as well, and that's something that was unintentional, but it's absolutely great that that's happened.
I absolutely agree with that assessment. About time. You say that there are quite a few books about women in jazz, and I do agree, but in comparison, not so many. And so finding one, and one of the things that I really enjoy about your book is the fact that you not only go into the story or the history, I should say, of women in jazz, but you also bring it to the present day, and you show that there is still a scene, and there's going to be a scene
Oh yeah.
in the future. And I think I obviously would suppose that this was one of your goals in writing this book, not just looking at at women in the history of jazz, but also looking at what women within jazz mean in the present day.
Yeah, I mean, what I absolutely loved about so many of the women that I spoke to is that, okay, they might have a little moan, and everyone's got a little story, but they just get on with it. People like Terry Lynn Carrington, rather than just sit and moan about race and poverty and the lack of women and everything, she just goes to Berkeley and sets up a program for for women. And there are other people who they're accessing funds for women, or they're setting up funds for women, or they're deliberately encouraging women. And then there comes that really tricky area where you get other people saying, "Hang on, you're being sexist because you're only choosing." So it's kind of like, okay, well, where do we stop this? But the great thing that Sarah Brand and Terry Lynn Carrington both said to me, and this was about race, gender, the binary issue, LGBT, absolutely everything. They said the day has got to come where these issues are just not issues. People are just listening to the music, choosing the musicians they like loving the music, and these issues are just not there. And I really like that, because like when I did the little jazz festival that Jazz Bites Radio actually sponsored, I just chose musicians that I knew would be very, they were from Europe, they were from New Orleans, and they were from the UK, and people who were just going to entertain for the day. I didn't even think about anything else. So, and I ended up with this complete mix of ages, sexes, nationalities, and amazing music. And I just think that was how it, and that day was great. So that is how it should be. These issues, and the book is not just about these issues. The book, as I said from the start, there was no agenda. I just wanted to hear those stories. But on the other hand, I haven't silenced them either.
I totally agree with what you say, that the change will actually have taken place when we don't necessarily have to write a book about women in jazz specifically, yeah, but when we can actually see the contributions of these women to the music and to the history of jazz as the contributions of musicians who are great musicians that have really contributed a lot to the history of the music.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, as we're winding down the conversation, which really has been, extremely interesting to me, Sammy, and I totally appreciate, I really do, the time that you have put into answering our call here on the Jazz Flashes podcast. I know that this is a question that might be maybe a little bit difficult for you to answer, because there are so many different female jazz artists that you like, but could you tell us about a few, specifically some of these jazz artists that you talk about in the book that are still performing and that are maybe not as well known as some of the classic artists from the past, that maybe you would like to mention for our listeners who may have never heard of them? Maybe they'll like to, and myself too, to just go on the internet and try to find more information on their recordings or maybe their live gigs or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's this one lady whose music I'm really, really liking at the moment, and she's a Cuban, but she lives in Spain, so she's kind of had this influence of these two cultures, and her name is Arima Ariga, and she's so bubbly and lively, and she's a multi-instrumentalist, and she's incredibly creative. And then there's Jane Ira Bloom, a trombone player called Sarah Brand, sax player called Kim Cypher, who's just amazing. There's Barb Younger, who most people in the UK will know. And there's a young singer called Indira May, who's got this real special quality to her voice as well. And then there's people like Camille Thurman, who people will have known. But it's not just the women in my book. I mean, there are other incredible people that that are out there playing as well. So I mean, women, they're everywhere now. Women.
Well, I know some of those names. Barb Younger, for example, Jane Ira Bloom. I've listened to her latest two albums, and they're absolutely fantastic. The one that he recorded about, I mean, based on or inspired by, I believe it's Virginia Woolf. That's really interesting music that sometimes even transcends the label of jazz.
Yeah, and I keep finding more people. There's I'm doing another book, and this I've got people in there like Sylvia Bolognese, there's Shirley Smart, there's Georgia Mancio, Kitty LaRoe, Julia Beale, Millicent Stevenson. There are just so many incredible women, and I haven't even mentioned the vocalist. And the new book is I'm so excited because I've got people. I've got Sheila Jordan. I mean, she's 90 something, and then I've got right down to people who are sort of young and rocking and in their 20s. So, and I've literally got people from every continent in there as well. So it's just incredible. And one thing I wanted to mention as well is that when I wrote the last book was I actually got some input from some men because back in 1989 there was a record label set up in the UK. Initially it was called 33 Jazz, and it was just to help women. So I talked to their producer, the executive producer, and I also talked to John Russell, who's a chap who runs an event called Mopamozo, which is improvised musicians, because I have to say there seem to be more female improvisers than there are in the more sort of trad jazz areas. So maybe improvisation is moving on just a little bit quicker. So it's there are three men. So I'm doing tokenism here. There are three men in the book who I've also included. So so I just wanted to kind of point out that if you're seeking a male input, it is there. It's just quite small.
I suppose that your internet radio show is a good outlet for you to showcase some of these women and men whose music you enjoy. Could you briefly tell us a little bit about how we can listen to your radio show, and also what kind of a radio show it is?
I don't do a regular one, but I do series. So what will happen is I curate a series of 6 or 7 shows, and then they go out at peak times for different continents. So and it's on a station. If you go to jazzbitesradio.com, you can find our show times there, or come to my Twitter feed, and they often put they're very, very good at doing banners and things like that. So they often put these really clear banners with, featuring Sammy Stein show times. And what happens is Anthea Redmond, who's the owner, we usually co-host together, and we have a lot of laughs. But the main thing is we usually get about 10 tracks of music in there that people may or may not have heard. And one or two of them, they get listened to by big names now, and they've got record deals of it, because if you get a review from me and then you get played on air by Jazz Bites, that's brilliant exposure, even if I say so myself.
No, and that's a good thing, really. We need more of this kinds of ventures, really.
Yeah.
Now, besides all that you write, these radio shows that you're talking about, are there any new book projects that maybe you can tell us a little bit about, or is all of that hush hush?
No. It's it's no longer hush hush. I've been commissioned to do this new book, and it's the working title is Women in Jazz in Their Own Words. So these are 20 musicians. I've got Tina May, Sheila Jordan, Shirley Smart, Isabel Serling, Millicent Stevenson, loads and loads of people, Barb Younger again. But they're giving much longer interviews and wonderful pictures, I'm hoping, for it's going to be like a real journey with each woman on their kind of history. Some of them, the ones in their 20s, they don't have such a history as the ones, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, obviously. But it's to give readers a real insight into the journeys of women in jazz, but also the difference that's happening in different cultures and different places on the globe. So when I came to choose these women, the limit was 20 really for to get a decent interview with each one, an extended interview. And this isn't going to be a long conversation between each of us. So each of them, they've got tailored questions, if you like, according to their different backgrounds and their different, history, etc. So it's really going to be so that readers can engage with, okay, this woman comes from here, her background is this was her journey in jazz, this one is different, this is her journey. And it's not just in jazz, it's going to be other musics as well, because, as I said, most of these women, they're so creative. They're not just jazz players, many of them anyway. They've done cabaret, they've done classical. So, it's going to be really interesting. And I think I'm going to find it hard to make it just one volume.
So you're not using the work you've already done, but you're expanding on it with new interviews.
Yeah, because I don't think you can use what you've already done, because that's not fair on readers. I think we want to know more. So it's actually, like one lady, she told me in the pub once that she used to sing on the doorstep at 5. So my immediate question to her is, how, why, were you encouraged at home? Her answer was no, but you couldn't keep a good girl down. So it's things like that. It's those little nuances. And what I like about it is that I'll be interviewing them, and most of them, as many as I can personally, which means that you can get all the different movements, the different ways that they look at you, the different looks when they're telling a story. So I can add my own observations in there as well, such as they are for the reader, and kind of bring it to life for them.
Absolutely. And after reading Women in Jazz, the women, the legends in their fight, I really look forward now, Sammy, to this new book you're talking about. It just sounds, extremely interesting, and I think it will make once you finished it, and once you've published it, I think it'll make a great companion for the book that we're talking about right now.
Oh, thank you.
It really has been a pleasure to have Sammy Stein today on the Jazz Flashes podcast, and Sammy, I truly appreciate your time and the insights that you've given me and the listeners to the Jazz Flashes podcast. So I really, really thank you for being our guest today on the Jazz Flashes podcast. And of course, you can come back anytime you want to.
Thank you.
And of course, to everyone out there, I'd like to remind you that the title of the book is Women in Jazz, The Women, the Legends, and Their Fight, published just a few weeks ago by Eighth House Publishing, a book written by Sammy Stein, who was our guest on this episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. You can find more about her on Twitter. You can go to jazzbitesradio.com and listen to her radio shows, and you can be sure that that's something I'm going to be doing myself. Once again, Sammy, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast, which you'll be able to listen to on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. Mine is the copyright of this radio show, which was recorded live with no cuts in Jackson, Tennessee, in the United States of America in this year of 2019. Thank you very much for listening, and remember what old Billy Strayhorn and old Duke Ellington once said: it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. See you. So long, everybody.